Okay, we are super excited to bring our research to you and to show off all the many wonderful projects that our collaborative center has been doing. So today I would like to introduce Dr. Missy Cummings. Dr. Missy Cummings is the director of the Humans and Autonomy Laboratory at Duke University. She received her bachelor's degree in mathematics from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1988, her master's in space systems engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School in 1994, and her PhD in systems engineering from the University of Virginia in 2004. A naval officer and military pilot from 1988 to 1999, she was one of the U.S. Navy's first female fighter pilots. She is currently a professor in the Duke University Electrical and Computer Engineering and Computer Sciences Department. She is also a member of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Autonomous Transportation, a fellow for the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics, and a member of the board of directors for Veoneer, Inc. And today she's going to be talking to us about one of the many wonderful projects she's been doing on automated vehicles and how we as humans need to interact with this technology. And so with that, I think I will hand it over to Missy.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to kick off this center, and I'm going to talk today about work that I've been doing for this center really in the past year, thinking about the larger context is thinking about how certification authorities in the future should think about certifying not only these partially automated systems, but fully automated systems, but we're really just kind of taking baby steps right now towards that. All right, so with that, let me talk to you about something that is, I call this conundrum of partial autonomy. So if you see here on the left side of my screen, you know, we've got level 2+ driving. What do I mean by 2+? I mean that there is some partial automation that are covering in some operational domains where the computer can do some of the driving, but the human is expected to be paying attention and expected to take control whenever the computer is having a problem. And so what I'm representing here is there's some trade-off that potentially could be happening frequently or actually in the worst case, infrequently between computers and humans. So they have a shared responsibility. And why is that a problem? Well, if you look over here, this is what I call the skills, rule, knowledge, and expert-based framework, which really shows you that at this level, skill-based reasoning, computers can actually drive the car. I mean, just simply keep the car on the road in between the lane lines and do pretty well. And the cars can also do what we call rule-based reasoning, which is where cars can detect the stop sign, and then understand that what the car should do. It should start slowing, it should brake, it should see if there are other cars or potential obstacles nearby, and then go through the stop sign. But you know, right now, partially autonomous or autonomous cars can do this pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well. What happens, the problems start to come in this side of the SRKE framework, and that's where we see judgment under uncertainty. In this particular case, a partially occluded stop sign. That is a problem for all autonomous systems today, because even though you and I can see that that's clearly a stop sign, we don't need to see the S, the T, the left-hand side of the sign. We know it's a stop sign. Unfortunately, cars can't see that. They don't have the ability to fill in the gaps in the way that the human brain does. Moreover, at this expert-based level, where ultimately somebody's going to have to break the rules. In this particular case, if you saw the stop sign with these 4 do not go this way signs, there's no way that you can go out. You got there by some mistake that you made, and now you're going to have to break the rules to get out of this situation. And cars, again, the computers, the stack, doesn't have the ability to actually do this judgment under uncertainty and to figure out what to do when the rules are going to be broken. And so one of the problems that we see with these partially automated systems is there is likely a gap somewhere in here. And indeed, how we're going to potentially figure out, are they here? Are they doing the lower half well enough? So that's one question, because you cannot go up to the higher levels of reasoning if you can't get these lower levels of reasoning figured out. But then what is happening is cars are basically relegated to this particular side of the screen. And as you can see here, what's really happening is in the driverless car world for L2, L3 systems, and even with autonomous systems with safety drivers, we're breaking this what needs to be a continuous process in half. We're saying the cars can do the bottom-up reasoning that's required, but the humans have to do the top-down reasoning. Unfortunately, because we're essentially breaking this, what needs to be a continuous process in half, what we need is humans to consistently be monitoring, and so they can do a handover in a timely fashion. Unfortunately, because we're breaking this and humans are, you know, I'm sure Tesla and other manufacturers would say, but we tell the human that they should always be paying attention. Because this lower half of the curve is done pretty well, even though the manufacturers say they aren't breaking it, it is being broken because human attention and human distraction is essentially meaning that humans are not going to be paying attention at these lower levels, and then we're going to see problems when this situation occurs. So to start looking at this, we developed 4 tests that I'm going to quickly tell you about. We're going to go through this very fast. This talk normally takes about an hour and a half. So we're going to go very quickly. These 4 tests really look at execution, how well the car performs under different scenarios of complexity. I'll explain all these later. But one of the other things that we're testing is how much driver alerting is occurring, because like I said before, what we want is a continuous process. And if humans are breaking this continuous process by not paying attention, by being distracted, this driver alerting situation is critical for bringing the humans back into the loop so that they can understand what's happening at the lower levels of this curve and intervene in an appropriate manner. So these were all the first 3, the curve, construction, and lane departure tests were done on the North Carolina Center for Automotive Research track here in North Carolina. We rented 3 2018 Tesla Model 3s through an app that you can just rent any person's car. It's kind of like Airbnb for cars. Each car for each test went through 10 randomized runs. There's 1 driver with 1 assistant. We do have a potential confound, which is representative of the real world. Even though we had 3 different Model 3s, they were the same make and model year, that they each all had different software versions, which was completely out of our control. And indeed, over a 2-day test period, one of the cars, the software was upgraded overnight between the 2 tests. Again, out of our control. You can read the paper that talks more about this. So we didn't have complete control over all the internal settings, but to the greatest extent possible, these cars, we made them the same as much as we could. And these were all tested in a 6-hour window in March, in the first 2 weeks of March. And in fact, we got the last test done, I think the day before we all went into COVID lockdown. Okay, so the first test that I'm going to tell you, sorry, before that, let me show you how we reported all the data. We had 3 different cameras at 3 different viewpoints. So we wanted to see the road in front of the car. We wanted to see what the driver was doing, because what you're going to see is we need to be able to detect when the driver's hands are coming on and off the steering wheel, and then what the driver is potentially seeing. In all these tests, the driver was a confederate, meaning the driver was acting like a distracted driver, but was not distracted. So what do we mean by distracted? Teslas have a torque monitoring system for their driver monitoring system. So Tesla's model is that you can tell whether or not a human is paying attention by having their hands on the steering wheel. I'm not going to bore you with my tirade against why that's not really a driver monitoring system. We're going to accept Tesla's proposition in this case. So, but by distraction, we're going to say that the driver completely has their hands off, assuming that they're distracted by another task, but indeed the driver was paying attention. And that's going to become critical, as you're going to see. All right, so for test 1, we wanted to see when an autopilot is placed in a challenging road environment after a loss of lane markings. What that means is Either you have the lane markings on the side of the road and the dash line down the middle. What happens when those lines are lost? And then the driving scenario is very demanding. Will the driver be alerted in a timely manner? Are we going to make sure that that curve is continuous? And will the car be able to maintain safe control, which is actually kind of looking right at the skill level. I mean, perception of these cars is critical. So we wanted to test whether or not that was going to happen. We also want to know what is the between and within car variability. We're trying to develop some models to think about how to basically validate the underlying logic of these cars. And we didn't really have a sense of, do we see a lot of variability between different cars? Maybe, I didn't know. And also within a single car, well, how reliable is one car? If it does the same scenario over and over again, how reliable will that be? So let me show you what the test track looked like. So what happens right here, the car starts, it accelerates to 35 miles per hour, autopilot is engaged, it tracks these lane lines, the lane lines disappear right here. Then the car is going to experience a 120-degree turn, followed by a 109-degree hairpin turn, and then we expect the test to conclude in this area. Now, at this time, the driver's hands are off the steering wheel here, and the driver never touched, that was the design, is the driver would not touch at all, despite the fact that the car would be warning this. So we expected the car, Tesla says, and this is in their manuals, that you'll get one warning, which says apply slight turning force to steering wheel, and this is what that looks like. You get a second warning, and the only thing that changes is this blue section of the screen right here. And then third strike, you're out. If you don't still take your hands over, and this is a 10-second, 5-second, and then after 15 seconds, if you don't put your hands on the steering wheel, then autopilot is going to slow the car down, stop, and you're penalized for not having autopilot until you turn the car off and turn it right back on. So we wanted to see, first of all, if the warnings were going to happen this way, if they were going to happen on the timeline, and where they were going to happen. And also how well the car could control itself in this environment. So this is what it looks like in the real world. And so let me explain to you what we saw. So right off the bat, I want to tell you, against my expectations, I rode with my students when they did this. It was, I mean, I flew fighter jets for the military. It was uncomfortable to be in this car around these hairpin turns and have autopilot do all the steering. And it did. In all 30 trials, autopilot made it through this whole track. It was alerting the driver, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it did safely stop the car in 30 trials, and the human never had to take over. So, however, so that was good. However, there was exceedingly high variability in when that first alert to the driver would happen. So let's assume that the driver is distracted, possibly asleep. We've seen that in many instances. So there was a cluster of alerts. So 5 of alerts of car 2 happened almost right after the loss of lane markings, where it said, okay, put your hands on the road. The first alert. The biggest cluster happened here at zone 2, about about an eighth of a mile into it. Then there was another large cluster of first alerts. And then the last cluster of first alerts happened very, very close to the end, about a quarter of a mile down the track. So it was interesting to us that, and it wasn't the same car, right? So car 2 had this cluster and this cluster, car 1 and 3 were here, and a few others here. And indeed, you can see in this graph right here, you can actually see the number of alerts that would happen for the first alert. So this is really important because there was a lot of variability for the initial time the driver would have taken over. Now remember, there were no other cars on the track. This was a closed track, as sterile as we could get it. So if anything had gone wrong, there was a significant number of alerts that would have happened in the middle to late, but cars traveled 26 seconds before the autopilot alerted the human that they needed to be paying attention because there was a loss of lane markings. And that was basically a quarter of a mile down the track. Now, once the first alert happened, they were rock solid, like 10 seconds with very little variability, and then 5 more seconds for the second alert. So once the first alert happened, which is perception dependent, right? So the question is, we can't get into the code, but we suspect that there's something in the perception system that would trigger that first alert because there was such variability. So we decided to look at brightness, which was measured by Luma. We have a paper about this that we can share if you really want to see more about this. We did an analysis of covariance to see what factors would predict the brightness, and what we saw was that there's something about zone 1. So zone 1 had something different happening in it. We don't know what that is, but zone 1 was different than the other zones. And there was also an interesting, strong relationship with the sun angle. And so this is I'm not the first person to think about this. And the NTSB has called this out, that it is actually possible that the sun angle has some difference, some effect on how the perception systems. We went from 11 to 5 a.m. and in March, the sun angle at that time can be quite different. We then went to see whether or not there was a logistic regression relationship. I mean, think of this as a baby machine learning model. In that model, only brightness was significant, but sun angle. So it's not a super strong relationship, but we know that brightness, there is something with brightness. It's not clear that sun angle, is it actually the brightness in the sky? Is it the sun angle that's causing some of the variability? There's definitely more work that needs to be done, but clearly there is something about the perception system that is causing that variability in the alerts. All right, so a little bit of summary. Car did well. Not clear about the autopilot handover. Brightness, sun angle, maybe have some effect. But it's not clear whether this is a design flaw or is it a communication problem? Is it a perception flaw? Is it somehow the perception not communicating with the system right? So if we think about this relationship, this perception did very well. I was very impressed with how the system worked. But, there was clearly a breakdown in the alerting of the system, which could have allowed the human who, if they had been completely distracted, going a quarter of a mile, 26 seconds without some kind of alerting is dangerous. And again, this was in the best possible environment. If there had been any other problems, it could have ended up badly, and which we will see is we are going to end up in some bad situations with some of the other tests. So test 2, construction zone. There's been a lot written about cars, whether it's Tesla, Waymo, their inability to negotiate construction zones. So we created one, and we wanted to see how well the alerting would happen back to the human, like the test before, and also how well the car would negotiate the construction zone. We also wanted to see what would be the between and within car variability. All right, so same 3 Teslas. Now, let me say right now, car 2 was a Model 3 2018 that had the full self-driving capability. We didn't use it, we didn't engage it. This was just part of what came with this car. However, what we did in this, just so you know, is that we disabled the visualization, not the full self-driving. That's just part of the system that we could not control. But that means that the full self-driving visualization would not be coming back into the car. And you'll see why in a couple of minutes why that's important. So 30 runs, 10 runs each. This one was at 25 miles an hour. And then what happened is a car was accelerated 25 miles an hour. Then at the lane lines, it had the autopilot engaged. And then there were 7 cones right here, 7 cones that would actually show you the edge of the construction zone. In North Carolina, sometimes the construction zones actually paint new lines on the road. North Carolina is a pretty good state to drive in if you have some kind of automated navigation system. So we lay that here just in case, you know, and it's a crutch. We're letting the system have a crutch, and we're basically giving the system the full, you know, the best possible situation to operate in. Then, so let me show you what happened. So if you were in car 2 and you had been in a construction zone, you would either be dead and kill everybody else in the construction zone, or you would be badly injured. In all 10 trials, the driver had to intervene and maneuver the car. The car would have just driven straight into the construction zone. Cars 1 and cars 2 always avoided the construction zone. So curiously, the car with the full self-driving chip was actually the most dangerous car. In this graph here, you can actually see where an alarm, if it gave you an alarm. So you'll see up here in the upper right, cars didn't always give you an alarm that you were in the area, right? So in theory, the car should 100% of the time alert you that there's some kind of obstacle in your path. Clearly, we can see cars 1 and cars 3 knew that there was an obstacle and successfully avoided it, but only, you know, a little bit more than half the time did they actually give an alert. And you can actually see where that happened right here. What's funny about car 2 is, despite the fact that it wanted to kill you 3 out of 10 times, so 30% of the time, it at least let the driver know there was a problem. Although I think we can all agree 30% of the time when the car is not going to avoid the full avoid the cones, not good for the full self-driving car. All right, so we didn't really monitor driver monitoring, so we weren't monitoring how well the torque monitoring. We just don't have time in those kind of scenarios. But the perception system was good in cars 1 and 3. That's why it gets a half a green. Awful in car 2, not clear why the car was full self-driving. You know, we spoke with the owner of the car about this. He had been having some troubles with the car, but and it's not, he complained about his own autopilot, so it's not clear why that was happening. It's not clear also whether cars 1 and car 3 were they were navigating on the yellow line or they actually saw the cones. I mean, it must have seen something, because 6 and 7, about 65% of the time, those cars were alerting the driver. So it must have seen something. In a second round of tests, one of the things we want to do is take away that yellow line to make sure to see how well all cars would do in these scenarios, and also put other cars on the road, right? Because now the car is the only car on the road when these things are happening. So it would be interesting, although it's going to be a much more difficult test to do if we put more cars out there. So overall, 46% of trials did not have an alert. That's not good. Even if we take crazy car 2 out, it's still 35% did not receive an alert. That's bad, right? Because 35% of the time, if you go into a construction zone, the car's not going to alert you to the fact that there's one there, and there could be problems. So I think that's an important issue. I think my student, he just reported right before I got on this call that he investigated the brightness, and there was no effect. So the brightness did not have any influence in this test. All right, test number 3, emergency road departure. So Teslas are supposed to have emergency road departure, that if the car detects that you're going off the road, that it will steer you back onto the road. This is supposed to be true regardless of whether you're in autopilot or not, right? So you don't have to be in autopilot for this to work. So what we did is we tested this. We put instead of autopilot, we used automated cruise control, and we also, again, wanted to see the within-car variability. Again, we're testing whether or not the car is actually going to maneuver you back on the road. And again, how's it going to alert you? Is it going to keep you on this continuum so that you would understand what is happening? So in this particular case, the car starts. It is never going to go into autopilot, accelerate to 35 miles an hour, go to automated cruise control, track on the lines. Right about here, the driver puts a 3 to 5 degree nudge into the steering wheel, extremely slight, and we'll talk about checking that later. and the car would head to the edge of the road, and the expectation is that the car would pull itself back onto the road, and we finished right about here. The expectation is that there should be a visual and audio alert that would go along with this, as well as active steering. So for 100% of the trials for each of the 3 cars. Okay. No crazy behavior from car 2 in this. We ended up having to drop 2 of the trials out of the 30 because the nudge was not sufficient. The car was just driving itself well enough that it never took itself off the road. So we did check the angle of wheel rotation using those movies that I showed you before that we were able to record. There was no statistical difference in wheel angle input, so that's not a confound. So one of the things that you can see here is while there was no statistical difference in the car performance, generally they all performed not well. 50% of these trials would have ended with a distracted driver off the road, meaning that 50% of the time there was no alert, no active steering, nothing. And if the driver's eyes were off the road, then the person would have been off the road. Only 21% of the time, basically 1 out of 5 times, did these cars actually provide active steering assist. And they all did, right? It was true that car 2 had the lowest number. Car 2 only did this 1 time, but it could do it, right? And the other cars were also similarly not good. So, you know, we've all been there where you're distracted just for a minute and the car drifts a little bit, but it would have been an unfortunate situation here if the car, if our driver had not been paying attention. So if I'm going to grade this, I'm going to say perception system, awful. And I think what is so interesting about this is the perception system in the curve test was awesome. It did great in what I would consider a really tough environment. In this environment, very gentle. Like you would think that this would be the easiest case, that the cars in this could really nail it. And in simplest of cases, the cars did terrible. So it's not clear whether this is a perception system or it is, you know, was there not enough training? One of the things I wonder is, because there was such a slight difference between the road edge and, you know, there's pavement and then grass, so it should have been able to be seen by the perception system. Same grass and pavement in the curve test. So it makes me wonder if the more angles that you have, the more discrimination that you have between the road edge and the angle of the car, that may be helping the car. It suggests to me that maybe engineers are spending too much time on the really hard cases and not enough time on the more likely cases, which are these slight angle off on the road edge. We did investigate brightness, just new results, no effect. So there was no different brightness across all these trials. All right, last but not least, highway driver monitoring. So now we want to know how consistent the cars are in alerting you that your hands are not on the steering wheel on the interstate. There have been several accidents, including deaths, where drivers did not have their hands on the steering wheel. Tesla says that, you know, it's speed dependent. It can alert you as fast as 10 seconds, or you can go for a couple of minutes or more, depending on the speed of the car without your hands on the car. So we wanted to check how reliable the car was at detecting your hands. Also, when you put your hands back on, because the expectation is if you're driving down the highway, you've got your hands on the steering wheel, you take your hands off, Tesla alerts you, then you put your hands back on, and then once the car senses that your hands are back on, you can take your hands off, and the car should stay in autopilot. That is the expectation, but we wanted to see how long this was. Was it just a couple of seconds? Was it 5 seconds, 10 seconds? And also, was it variable between cars and within cars? So we used a 5-mile one-way track on the Triangle Expressway here in Raleigh-Durham, and you can see the map here. So the car would drive 5 miles one way and then get back on and go back. So my student would just go back and forth over this. And we were trying to do as many trials as we could in each of these one-way tracks, meaning the student would accelerate, get the car on autopilot at 70 miles an hour, which is the posted speed limit, and then, you know, take his hands off, get the hands back on, hands off, hands off. So that led to 162 total events. We had to drop 13 because for whatever reason, the data wasn't recorded, or we had some confounded timing. And this would be the alert, just like the alert that you saw. It would only be the first alert because, you know, we would put our hands back on, but then expect that the car would keep going in autopilot once we let go of the steering wheel once an alert occurred. So then here are the results that we got. So car 2, again, huge problem in this test. Car 2 just had a mind of its own. My student actually, at the end of this series of tests, my student was like, that's it, I'm never gonna buy a Tesla. I can't take it, car scares me to death. And that's because, you know, we would be in the middle of doing these tests, and then the car would just start veering off. You know, there was a slight curve in the road and the car would just go off. And autopilot was engaged, and it would just start doing whatever it was doing. And so that is why you see much fewer cases in car 2, because once the car did something bad, the student would end the trial, take the car to the end point, and like he did for all cars, he would get out, shut it off, get out, and then get back in. The reason that's important is the only way you can get a hard reset on the car is you have to turn it off and leave the car, and then get back into the car, and that resets the car. But despite all those resets, we had a lot of problems with car 2. But car 2, these are the failures in car 2. So, and what does that mean? That the car just failed to alert you that there was a problem. But there was one of the other issues that we had was in all 3 of the cars, there would be this weird, you would get the alert, put your hands back on, you would put your hands back on, and then you would take your hands off, and then autopilot would disengage, and there wouldn't be a notification that autopilot disengaged. But it would stop. Well, I'm sorry, there was the little light, but there was no other indication other than, and so especially the way that you're positioned, if you let go of the steering wheel, it's very likely that you could think that autopilot is engaged, because all these other times it was. So this is an interesting result that basically I think it was 3.6% of these. So a little over 94% of the time when drivers put their hands on after a warning and released it, autopilot kept going. 3.6% of the time it wouldn't. And so we're going to talk about that in a second, because that's dangerous. All right, so this was did it actually alert? What was that cycle time? Tesla nailed it, right around 30 seconds, a little bit over, but that's pretty much at 70 miles an hour. It's a linear relationship that it's supposed to be. We checked it through a regression. It is pretty darn linear. Every 0.9, 0.3 decrease in average speed leads to a 1 second increase in the distance and the time interval that you get to have your hands off. So we actually also touched that time to clear alarm. No significant difference. It was around 4 to 5 seconds that it took you to have your hands on the steering wheel and the alert would happen. But let's get back to that 3.6% of successful trials ended with an unexpected handover. So this is important because there have been many cases of people having accidents in Teslas where they swear the autopilot was on. And then Tesla pulls the tapes, looks at the digital files, and they can back it out. They're like, autopilot wasn't on, so it's your fault, driver. Technically, that's true, but that's a problem if drivers are, basically, it's Pavlovian response. If 96% of the time the car lets you take your hands off and it stays in autopilot, you can see where if you're complacent and 100% of autopilot drivers are going to get complacent with that. There is no person that is not going to be immune to that. The question is, how complacent are you, and are you paying attention, and do you get it in that one time, in that one out of you know, a very small percentage time? Is it going to matter to you, and are you going to be paying attention? So, and if we actually think about that over the percent engagements of everybody driving a Tesla every day, 3.6% of millions of engagements is a lot of unexpected handovers where people are thinking. And I've seen it myself. You know, I've been with friends in cars where they're on autopilot and they just touch to get rid of the autopilot nag, and they're blah, 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 talking, and they don't really realize, oh, the car actually is making you take over and you don't realize it. Car 2. It's funny. Car 2 had the most consistent alerting when it would alert, so it had the smallest deviation, although it also had the smallest number of trials. But if we look at Tesla forums about weird behavior with cars with full self-driving, this wasn't the only car. This is actually not unexpected behavior from those cars with that capability. In theory, they're fixing this with over-the-air updates, but we'll talk about that in a second. And last but not least, you know, I think it's wrong. I think you should not be able to go 30 seconds with your hands off the steering wheel at 70 miles an hour down an interstate. A lot of bad things can happen at 70 miles an hour going down an interstate. And so, you know, I just don't even know why the NHTSA or any of the SAEs, why are we accepting this? You know, what do I think if I were queen of the world? What would I have it be? 5 seconds at the most, right? But 30 seconds, a lot of bad things can happen. And we've seen a lot of bad deaths at the expense of autopilot because there was long gaps in this alerting and people didn't, you know, people were distracted either intentionally or unintentionally, and it led to their deaths. All right, so let's look at the meta-analysis. So if remember I showed you before what we thought, this is what happened actually. You know, the highway tests, we think it was easy for car 2, but the car performed terribly. Although on the highway test, it was an easy test and cars 1 and 3 performed very well. All right, so, but I have a question mark because I don't believe that 30 seconds, people should be allowed to go 30 seconds at 70 miles an hour without their hands on the wheel. That's just my opinion. All right, lane departure. This should have also been easy. Cars 1, 2, and 3 all did bad. Car 2, deadly. 1 and 3 did pretty well, except that they had inconsistent alerting. The curve test, if you recall, I actually thought it was going to perform badly. The cars performed well, but also super inconsistent driver alerting. And why does that matter? Because there are a lot of other variables that we controlled for to make this test as safe as possible. But there's a lot of uncontrolled variables that happen in the real world. And actually, after looking at these tests, I'm actually surprised that we're not seeing more accidents than we do. Now, if I take the bigger view of it, you know, the perception systems for the cars for cars 1 and 3 were relatively consistent. They were also the cars who did not have the full self-driving capability, but they were consistent, both good and bad, right? When they worked great. When the perception system didn't work, it was consistently bad. So, you know, if I, as a certification authority, and I've talked a lot about this before in a lot of my other papers, we really need to, you know, get at that issue of, you know, what should we be accepting through, you know, should we have vision tests? There's some cases, the lane departure test here, like there is no way like the lane departure test of Tesla is working correctly. Now, I'd like them to show me their results so they can prove me wrong, but from whatever I saw here, you know, that lane departure, which is actually the most likely condition of all the tests that we did here, other than the highway test, that is probably going to be the one condition that people find themselves the most often. Autopilot handover alerting all over the place. Driver monitoring, actually, this did better than I thought it did. It was consistent, except that in car 2, it failed in 30% of the trials. So again, for cars 1 and 3, it was consistently good. consistently bad in car 2 and dangerous. Indeed, car 2's performance is a mystery. It had some of the best performance. If you remember in the curve test, at least for half of the trials, car 2 gave the first earliest alerting, and then it was also the latest in alerting. The other 50% were in the last zone. So car 2 could be safe, and it was consistent in some of its alerting, but I would generally say the car was unsafe in 3 out of 4 tests. Maybe there were some issues that were being solved with over-the-air updates, but this is why I call it the albatross. You should not be using the general public to be working out issues with your system. And what this suggests to me, car 2 was so bad, I can't believe that this was the only car. I mean, what are the odds that we would randomly select the only full self-driving car that was not performing? I know that's not true because I can look at the Tesla forums to see that that's not true. So it suggests to me that when there's a rollout, we can upload it to a car with the over-the-air update with new software, great, and then you'll get drivers yelling and screaming and maybe in the forums and complaints back to Tesla, and then we fix it. That is actually the Silicon Valley way. That is how phone manufacturers, other software manufacturers do it. That's the fundamental premise of agile software development. And just get it good enough, roll it out, let our users figure out what the problems are. I mean, that's okay for your phone, but it's not okay for a safety critical system. And so I think there needs to be a lot more effort in figuring out what is going on with over-the-air updates. Are they safe? And generally, what should not be allowed to be tested on the public? And so if we go back to my original analysis and we talk about the skills, rule, knowledge, expert-based continuum, there is some good that's happening in the perception system, but I would say overall, the perception systems of these cars, the Tesla Model 3s, the 3 exactly, and I think we can generalize more broadly. Look, this is an unsafe set of perception systems. That shouldn't matter if the driver monitoring system is really good. I mean, as long as this whole curve is continuous and the drivers are staying engaged, the fact that you have a bad perception system, that's actually survivable and not really necessarily a bad thing as long as people are paying attention. But that red dotted line, what that means is you are breaking that, the manufacturer is breaking it because it's lulling the operators into a false sense of security that they don't have to be paying attention all the time. If you are told that you can go 70 miles an hour and go for 30 seconds without paying attention, which is what that driver monitoring system is doing, you are habituating very, very bad behaviors in humans. And so even though you claim that it's the driver's responsibility, you're also designing the system to ensure that you are going to break this curve, that humans cannot bring their knowledge and expert-based decision-making back into the driving experience, and that you are going to end up with accidents. All right, so with that, I thought we would go to questions and see how people wanted to either take me to task over thing or ask questions about the various tests.
Thank you, Missy. This is Laura Sant with CSCRS. Wes has had to leave the webinar, so I'm going to help look and see what questions we've received from the audience. And the first question we have is one from someone involved with Bike Walk NC, who asks if you have done any testing or have any plans for how vehicles perform in relation to other objects or non-vehicular recognition, such as pedestrians and bicycles.
So that is a great question. Hang on a second. I've got a teenager. Look right behind you. There you go. Sorry. So it would be great. And if you go to my website, we did do a test that looked at how pedestrians would behave around cars, looking at their cell phones. It didn't really matter whether the car was human driven or driverless. And that experiment was very difficult to run. And I would tell you that the one problem, and there have been other people have rolled out crash test dummies and whatnot in front of the vehicles. They're just, there's potentially a high risk in all of these experiments. And again, the one with cars present, the other cars present, how the cars would behave, you could imagine in that construction test, what if, you had to decide when to merge in traffic because, I just drove to Charlotte, just actually to South Carolina past Charlotte. And if you've been on those roads, oh my God, they're horrible, right? With the merging that has to happen. And it'd be interesting to see, when you're presented with that scenario, and there's another decision that has to be made on top of avoiding the cones, what would the car do? So I definitely want to explore the obstacles. We are always open to more collaborations with other people if you want to work with us on these experiments. But yeah, it's and working at the NCAR, the North Carolina Center of Automotive Research, that has been a fantastic experience. So, we do have the closed track access as part of this program. And so again, there's at least some things that we could do on the small scale, if not on a larger scale later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like there's endless opportunities to increase the complexity of some of these tests and layer on some of these difficult decision-making scenarios. We have another question from Liza asking about, given this experience with the Tesla cars, what's your opinion of a level 2 hands-free system such as a Cadillac Super Cruise?
So it's a great question. We originally wanted to include Cadillac, the Super Cruise, in this set of tests. The problem is that you can only use Super Cruise on mapped highways inside of Cadillac's database. And so we just can't use it on the closed track. So, we have this great closed track and we can't drive the Super Cruise on it. Now we could, of course, run it through the highway tests. One of the other issues, once we get the report written that will be available to you on the CSCRS website, is maybe giving that to Cadillac and asking them. I have a great relationship with GM and asking them if they would update their database to include that. We'll see how far we can go with that. But this is actually just, again, one of the limitations of Tesla, of testing other cars with limited databases. Then you can only do what you can do. And I just would not feel, it's so stressful. Running these tests are pretty stressful. There's just some things I would never do on a public road.
Thank you. I think that question also answered one or two from Sam as well. We have another question coming in from Michael asking about, so while Tesla uses its customers as human test subjects and has by far the most test cars on the road, virtually every other AV maker does the same, only they use employee test drivers. How does that affect this practice? Is it more acceptable? Why not use aerospace or other simulations, gaming technology to minimize the use of human subjects?
Yeah, so it's a great, there's actually a set of questions, and there's not just one question, I think. So one question is, let's just take the simulation testing. So how good is simulation testing for these environments? So simulation testing, I think, is a good, necessary first entry point into testing your system. You need a simulation environment to test the skill-based aspects of your system, the rule-based aspects of your system, and maybe you think you can test some knowledge-based aspects of your system, but I'll tell you, this is where that, if you recall, that curve of uncertainty is growing. And even though we say that we can program uncertainty into our simulations, you can't. You just cannot program in the uncertainty that you think you need to actually ultimately certify your systems. Now, that being said, so I think simulation testing is really good to see how your skill and rule-based aspects of your system, are they working under the scenarios that you think you are? And you really should not be doing any human testing at all until you can get past your simulation testing. But the reality is these systems are going to have to mature and go from simulation into the real world, right? So it is not it's not a mutually exclusive arrangement. It is test and simulation. Then you're going to have to, there might be some overlap for some period of time, but you're going to have to graduate these systems to the real world. And why is that? Look, I just showed you some test results that indicated there is something with brightness and sun angle. It didn't happen in any of the other tests, but it happened in the curve test. And the reason I think it happened in the curve test is, if you recall, the car was changing directions throughout that course, big changes in directions. Whereas in all the other tests, the cars were linear in the, unidimensional in that one direction. And so what we may be seeing is the fact that those sun angles, the brightness for cars that are changing their headings in, I would say, more than 15, 20 degrees, you actually may see a bigger result from the environmental conditions. Well, you're not going to be able to actually see that until you actually get it out in the world. It'll be a long time before there's a simulation environment that can accurately capture the effects of brightness, for example, or even long shadows. And this, if you're a Tesla driver, you know what I'm about to say is true. Long shadows in the afternoon, that can destroy Autopilot's ability to track roads, right? So, what the nature of those shadows are going to be, you could potentially program some of that to do some testing, but again, until you get it out in the real world under the different conditions, you're going to miss it. The lane departure test, you're going to miss how the deviation of the road, like what was it between the grass and the concrete, why wasn't that perception system seeing that? You're not going to get that in simulation.
Mm-hmm. I think you really articulated the value of having both simulation and real world. I wonder about the second aspect of this question, which is around testing owners involved in driving these vehicles versus employee tests, and if there's ethical considerations around informed consent.
So thank you for reminding me that I had actually said there were lots of questions in that question, and I have written many times that I think it is unethical, and I think it goes against the Code of Federal Regulations to use unwitting human subjects in tests. I would say that that's true for major software rollouts. And of course, Elaine Hertzberg, who died in Tempe, Arizona, was in a test that she did not know about, right? So I do think that there needs to be more focus on how we are using people to do testing in ways that they don't realize that they're in tests. And I do think that it's consequential. The owner of the car that we drove with the full self-driving chip, he basically said he never used it anymore because the car scared him, to a point that, it was just unusable, and he called Tesla several times. That's actually, it's just so wrong that there could ever be an event where, it's not like we can buy a phone and the phone almost kills us 4 or 5 times. If we had this in any other aspect of our life, even if it wasn't safety critical, we would not accept that, right? So it's interesting to me that as drivers, we're willing to accept some really bad, scary, unsafe behavior, but we are not willing to accept that in other aspects of our life. I do think that there's some, business issues. The Tesla stock is crazy high. Elon Musk can't do any wrong. And so there are issues, I think, that affect us that are non-technical. What I really think that this points to is a very ineffective and weak regulatory agency But again, we're in a political climate where regulatory administrations are devalued in general, and I think that's a problem. So I think ultimately where hopefully some of this gets ironed out is through places like insurance. So how your insurance is set is maybe one way, and that is being reflected. I mean, it is crazy hard to get good insurance if you're a Tesla driver. Unfortunately, that's not enough right now to swing what I think the pendulum needs to come back the other way. And I think more testing, if you're doing a major software upgrade that changes anything about the control aspect of a car, I think it should have to go through a lot more in-house human testing before it's released.
Okay, thank you, Missy. I'm going to move us on to the next question, which comes from Assad and Assad Katak from UTK. And so you did 4 different test applications in this study. What of those 4 were most closely related to what you see as, actual crashes or the common crash scenarios that you are wanting to sort of replicate in this more closed environment?
Yeah, so I think that the lane departure test is the most likely common misuse of automation. That actually is probably true of well beyond Tesla, because remember, we only use the automated cruise control. And so people will often, again, in other cars, engage that and check their phone. This is a good time to check my phone because nothing else is happening, and then they start drifting off the road, and then they, I've been guilty of that myself. So I do think that is the most common scenario where people could be badly, badly hurt, and there's a lot of accidents that have happened where drivers have claimed that they thought autopilot was on and they didn't realize it was off. So that ties into the other test, which is the highway test. I think the 2 of those tests combined, the lane departure test and the highway test, show you a lot about a car's inability to detect slight changes in its road trajectory under what it would, these were bright sunny days. These were ideal conditions for these cars. That coupled with the 30 seconds that you get if you're going 70 miles an hour, and also that the fact that the autopilot doesn't, it's not clear to you when there's an autopilot handover. I think that's pretty significant, the 2 of those together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and thinking about the 3 cars that you used and the variability that you saw across them and then within them, do you have plans to scale up to look at more cars, even within the same type of vehicle, just to see if your findings continue to trend with a larger sample?
It would be great. I mean, Laura's the head of CSRS, so I'm about to say this, and it's not her fault, but it'd be great if we had more money, and we need more time on the University Transportation Center. She didn't pay me to say that, right? But I mean, the answer is yes. I'm one small lab, and we're working with Assad. So Assad and I can only do so much. He's working on the simulation angle, and we're working on the live testing data that's hopefully going to feed his simulation. So the 2 of us cannot solve this problem. I do think that there probably needs to be a university transportation center that focuses just on these issues, because there's so much. You've heard the other question about pedestrian, rural environments, urban environments, congestion. I think that there's so much more that needs to be done that all of us, including myself and the CSRS, we could use a lot more money and time to do this.
Well, I think you've ended us on a very good note about all of the work ahead that we have in our field, in our center specifically. And we do have many other questions. We had a wonderfully engaged audience. And so what I can do from here is share those questions with you, and hopefully you can respond directly to the people who had some, really interesting questions and thoughts that they'd like to hear more from you on. So
that sounds great.
Okay, thank you for your willingness to follow up, and thanks everybody to share who shared your questions today, and for your engagement in this webinar.